Good evening. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to the A. Scott Bullitt Lecture in American History, presented in partnership with Elliott Bay Book Company. The A. Scott Bullitt Lecture in American History is made possible by a generous gift from the late Priscilla Bullitt Collins in honor of her father, A. Scott Bullitt. Tonight's event is also supported by the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. We're also grateful to the Seattle Times for their generous promotional support for library programs. I'd like to give a big hello and welcome to all of our attendees here at Central Library and also watching the live stream. Before we get started, I have just a few announcements. If you're here with us in person, our friends over at Elliott Bay Book Companies have copies of Dr. Ferrer's book at their table, which is to your right. And if you're watching from home, you can find Professor Ferrer's books at Elliott Bay's website, elliottbaybook.com, and we'll be popping direct links to her books in the chat throughout the course of the program. For folks here in person, if you need to exit the auditorium during the event, there's a door to your right. You may have noticed that this door became a wall. So if you need to exit during the program, just head out that door there, and you'll notice that the building is officially closed, but the restrooms are open for the duration of the program. After tonight's presentation, there'll be time for questions from the audience. For folks here in person, you can write your questions on the cards that you received as you came in, and staff will collect them toward the end of the program. For folks watching from home, you can type your questions at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we're interested in hearing from you. For the end of the program, we'll post a link to a program survey in the online chat, and we'll also collect paper surveys from our audience here in person, and we'd appreciate it if everybody took a minute at the end of the event to fill it out. Now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Ada Ferrer is Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. She's the author of Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898, winner of the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history, and Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, which won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, as well as multiple prizes from the American Historical Association. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, Dr. Ferrer has been traveling to and conducting research on the island since 1990. Dr. Ferrer is here tonight to talk about her most recent book, Cuba in American History, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2022. Please help me welcome Dr. Ada Ferrer.
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to thank you, Seattle Public Library, Seattle Public Library Foundation, and Seattle Public Library staff for inviting me to give this year's Bullitt Lecture and for all their help in organizing and getting me here. I'm a huge believer in the institution of public libraries, so it is both a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. So thanks to all of you who've come out on this, I guess, very typical cold, wet evening, and to those of you joining us online. Tonight, I'll be talking with you about my most recent book, Cuba in American History. It was published in September 2021. And I have found since it came out that I have a lot of readers who ask me about that title and why I gave History of Cuba the subtitle, An American History. So I've organized my lecture here tonight as an extended 5-part answer to that question. And for each part of the answer, I'm going to draw directly from the book, hoping to give you a sense of the way I conceive of and the way I narrate history. And the way I narrate, in this case, what I see as an epic history. The history of Cuba lends itself to epic very easily. but I narrate that epic on what I call a human scale, sometimes even an intimate scale. So, part one of the answer. The first reason that I chose to subtitle my book An American History is to highlight the breadth and depth of the connections between Cuba and the United States. Those connections stretch back over centuries. And importantly, they run in both directions. It wasn't just the US influencing Cuba, it also worked the other way around. For instance, I think that few Americans have likely considered the significance of Cuba for the United States during the American Revolution. Cubans raised funds in support of Washington's army, and those funds proved decisive in the Battle of Yorktown. As the 13 colonies lost access to other British colonies, Cuba became a vital trading partner, and Havana's storehouse of coveted silver helped finance the new nation's first national bank. And in the first years of the 20th century, Cuba was consistently one of the United States' top 3 trading partners through the middle of the century. In the decades following independence, many leaders of the young republic imagined making Cuba an integral part of the United States. In 1809, for example, Thomas Jefferson expressed his desire that the borders of the United States reach all the way north to Canada and south to the southern coast of Cuba. As late as 1823, he still believed that, arguing, quote, that Cuba is this is a quote, Cuba is exactly what is wanting to round out our power as a nation to the point of its utmost interest. Cuba, he said, would fill up the measure of our political well-being. John Quincy Adams, for his part, prophesied the same thing, and that Cuba would actually become part of the United States. He said it was as inevitable as a ripe apple falling from a tree. It wasn't a question of if Cuba would become American. It was only a question of when. Later, in the 1840s, after Texas became a state, Southerners sought to annex Cuba to the US as a slave state, or even 2 slave states, or possibly 3 slave states, to bolster the power of slavery in the American Union. Then, in 1898, American intervention in Cuba's War of Independence resulted in the Spanish-American War. And it helped, and that war that the US entered in Cuba and also in Puerto Rico and Philippines helped usher in 2 very important developments in US history. The first was the reconciliation of the white South and the North after decades of disunion. And second, it helped propel the emergence of the United States as an imperial power on the world stage. Of course, the US loomed large over the birth of Cuba as well. Cubans had fought for their independence over 3 wars and 3 decades, beginning in 1868. But independence was achieved only after the US intervened in 1898 and won the Spanish-American War. So the end of more than 400 years of Spanish rule in Cuba was observed ritually on January 1st, 1899, at exactly noon, when every Spanish flag on the island was lowered. But in its place was raised not a Cuban flag, but an American one. And with that began a full-fledged US military occupation that ended 4 years later, only after Cuban leaders, under enormous pressure, agreed to grant the US the right of intervention in Cuba. Yet alongside that history, that contentious history of government relations, there existed dense networks of human contact, forged over decades by people of all kinds in both countries. Cuba's flag was designed and flown for the first time by Cuban exiles in the United States. The first pro-independence Cuban newspaper was published in Philadelphia. and the first national novel was written in New York. Cuba's most famous patriot and writer, Jose Marti, spent more of his adult life in the United States than in Cuba. And the largest memorial service for Cuba's most important 19th century military hero, Antonio Maceo, after whom generations of African Americans named their sons. The most important service for him was held at Cooper Union in New York City. Cubans traveled to the US to study at Harvard and Tuskegee, to play baseball in the US Negro Leagues, to escape dictators, to view the famous falls at Niagara. Americans traveled in the other direction as well, to drink during Prohibition, to buy land and cigars, to convert people to Protestantism, to forge networks of Black solidarity, to honeymoon and to fish, to hear jazz and to get abortions. Americans bought Cuban sugar and Cubans bought American appliances. Actually, Cubans bought just about everything from the United States except for sugar. And then all that changed, not overnight exactly, but almost. The exigencies of the Cold War has meant that for decades, Americans understood Cuba primarily as a small, if dangerously proximate, satellite of the Soviet Union. Yet its role in that global conflict notwithstanding, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 cannot be understood solely within a Cold War framework. The revolution was not one thing. It changed over time in goals and methods. Before taking power, it was emphatically not communist, nor particularly anti-American. Cubans supported it against the dictator Fulgencio Batista, not because they desired to live under socialism, and not because they desired to live at near war with the United States. Yet the revolution would produce both those outcomes in relatively quick succession. What explains how that happened is less the context of the Cold War than the revolution's relationship to history. Though understanding that history, fascinating on its own terms and intriguing in its thorny entanglements with the United States, is therefore vital. It is the fundamental interconnectedness of the two histories, the history of Cuba and the history of the United States, then that is the first part of my answer about why to call this book an American history. It is a history of a relationship, a contentious, always uneven, sometimes intimate. Okay, so now part two of my answer. The second manner in which I narrate Cuba as US history has to do with the ways in which the US was involved and implicated in some of the institutions that lie at the very heart of Cuban history. Perhaps the most important economic and social institution in the long history of Cuba was slavery. I've devoted much of my career to studying the institution in Cuba, and in many ways, and it's the subject of my first two books in many ways. But as I was researching this book, I was particularly surprised to realize how very deep Americans' involvement in Cuban slavery reached. So I'm going to share with you here the opening of one of my chapters on slavery. And it's a chapter that recounts one of the most surprising things that I discovered in my journey to write this book. So I'm just going to read from the book at a few points tonight. Okay, so bear with me. Eyesight isn't quite what it used to be. Actually, it's never been what it should be. All right. It was the worst inauguration in the history of the United States. That's a picture of it. The new president looked despondent as he stood alone to take his oath of office. His 11-year-old son had died in a train accident 2 months earlier. His wife, now the first lady, refused to attend the inauguration. She was angry at her husband for having accepted the nomination, and she was suffering from severe depression after having witnessed the death of their son. Maybe as a concession to her, maybe because of his own pain, the president had canceled the traditional inaugural ball. Even the weather refused to cooperate. As he delivered his inaugural address, a heavy snow began to fall. We do not know then with how much energy or conviction the new president pronounced the most saber-rattling words of his speech. He said, "The policy of my administration will not be controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. Indeed, our attitude as a nation and our position on the globe render the acquisition of certain possessions eminently important for our protection." And everyone there knew that he was talking about Cuba. It wasn't just the weather and family travails that weighed on President Franklin Pierce that cold inauguration morning in March 1853. Divisions over slavery and uncertainty over the future of the American Union cast a long shadow over the event as well. Newly elected Pierce, a Northerner, had appealed to Southerners because he rejected the abolition of slavery and advocated territorial expansion. His vice president, William Rufus King, a wealthy cotton planter whose family held some 500 people in slavery, was seen as a moderate in those times, a fierce defender of slavery who also excoriated the militant slaveholders flirting with secession. In 1853, then, the combination of Northern Pierce and Southern King was supposed to embody moderation in the era's most pressing questions. But because this was the worst inauguration in living memory, it somehow made sense that the vice president was not present to embody moderation or anything else. The vice president was instead a world away on a palatial sugar estate in rural Cuba, exhausted from the campaign and dying of tuberculosis. William Rufus King, that vice president, would take his oath of office as vice president of the United States on the highest point of an American-owned sugar plantation overlooking Black men and women bent over the tall stalks of cane as they harvested. Now, you might ask, why would a US vice president be in Cuba instead of Washington for the inauguration? The simplest answer is that the vice president was in Cuba. He was there to recover from tuberculosis. And at the time, doctors recommended something called the sugar cure. And the idea was that if you were sick and had tuberculosis, you would go to the beautiful Cuban countryside. You would spend your time on a sugar plantation and spend 3 or 4 hours every day sitting in the mill where the sugar was boiled. And the idea was that the fumes and the vapor and the heat would somehow work their wonders and cure tuberculosis. It didn't work, as you might imagine. It didn't quite happen like that. King died he went back home just a few days after taking his oath of office, and died on his plantation in the US. But as we sit here and ponder this very unlikely story, it seems absurd on the one hand. And even when, I've been studying Cuban history for over 30 years. When I first read that the US vice president took his oath of office in Cuba, I had to go back and reread it like 4 times, and then went into this rabbit hole to find out everything I could about it. So, but anyway, even if we could regard this so-called sugar cure as a kind of as an example of magical thinking or illogical thinking, there's other ways in which King's presence in Cuba seemed perfectly logical for its time. Recall that King and Pierce ran on a platform that was dedicated to making Cuba part of the United States. In the Victory March after Election Day, supporters had carried banners that read Pierce and Cuba. So having the vice president take his oath of office on a sugar plantation in Cuba, in a sense, marked the island as imminent US territory. It is also important to note here that the plantation that King took his oath of office on was in a region called Matanzas. And Matanzas was a province that was the center of Cuban sugar production at the time. And it was also a place that was full of plantations owned by American citizens. I want to give you an example of, another example of a political connection besides the vice president. The family of a Rhode Island senator by the name of James DeWolf. He was a senator. He was also a slave trader up until the 1820s. His family owned about 6 plantations in this area of Cuba. And that's a photo, that's a, not a photo, a drawing of one of them. And, I spent a lot of time, not a lot, I spent some time in Bristol reading the records of of their plantations. And you realize reading them that, that it was New England men who were supervising the clearing of forests and who were constructing or supervising the construction of the mills. They managed the production and sale of sugar. They bought and sold people. They separated families. They meted out punishments. The DeWolfs, this Rhode Island family, allowed neighboring Cuban slaveholders to use the DeWolf's stocks. Stocks were the wooden torture instrument used to punish the enslaved. So the DeWolfs would let other neighboring plantations bring their enslaved to their plantation to use their stocks as punishment. In the dark of night, enslaved people on the DeWolf plantations used the light of glowworms to serve them as candles in their huts. So these stories remind us how US citizens, even US politicians, can sometimes be found right at the heart of the institution of Cuban slavery. What is more, the profits from slave-grown Cuban sugar appear in sometimes unexpected places in the US. Those profits, for example, served as the basis for a modest monthly stipend sent back home by the DeWolfs every month to St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Bristol, Rhode Island, which still stands there today. Okay. So that is the second part of the answer, that the US is involved in some of the central institutions of Cuban history. Now I'm gonna, in the 2 examples that come to the 2 following parts, I'm gonna switch gears and take us to the 20th century, which we're all much more familiar with, I am sure. Okay. Now the third part of the answer, or the third way in which this that explains the subtitle, has to do with the way people in Cuba, and actually other parts of the world as well, it's not just a Cuban phenomenon, people in Cuba shape the exercise of US power abroad. We're all used to thinking about American power, US power exerted on a world stage. That is undeniable. But the world is a complex place, and the history and actions of its people can exert their own sway on the course of US directed events. To illustrate this, I'm going to draw on an extended example from the book. And I won't tell you right away what it's about, but I think you'll be able to figure it out. So this is from chapter 27. The book has 33 chapters, but they're all very short. All right, chapter 27. Geography has given the place a remarkable resistance to change. Located about 85 miles southeast and worlds away from Havana, the vast Zapata Peninsula houses living species as old as the Brontosaurus and the pterodactyls. Reeds rise up from a vast expanse of thick water, underneath which lies a dense, tangled forest of hardwood timber, many thousands of years old. In the rivers and lakes of the peninsula still swims the Cuban gar, a species so old and so unchanged that scientists categorize it as a living fossil. Much of the swamp extends into the Caribbean Sea. but in a few places, it gives way to a strip of solid sandy ground. Along part of that coast, a large shelf of dog-teeth rock, so named for the hard, jagged limestone that made the area so inhospitable, even after humans began to put shoes on draft animals. Near the eastern end of the vast wetlands is a deep, wide inlet. Like the swamp, it boasts ancient species, among them the reef dweller that probably gave the bay its name, the queen triggerfish, known in Cuba as cochinos, or pigs. Humans arrived much later to give names to those places and those species. Generations of Taínos, that's the native group in the area, generations of Taínos made their home in this unusual terrain, burying their dead, feet always to the west, under mounds that alternated black earth and snail shells. In 1493, Columbus hugged this coast on his second voyage. A century later, pirates were said to hide their treasure there. And 2 centuries after that, slave traders sometimes used the unwelcoming coast to land illegal cargoes of Africans, forced after their long, grueling voyage across the Atlantic to trek over the dog-teeth limestone in their bare feet. But these illicit uses aside, the place was so unwelcoming, so isolated from the rest of the island, that it was settled but sparsely, whether by the native Taínos or Spaniards or Africans, or the descendants of any or all of these. The wetlands were hardly arable, and there were no towns to speak of. So the people who did settle there worked hard to make a living. They harvested the swamp, using rudimentary tools and the weight of their own bodies to loosen heavy gnarled roots from under a foot or more of thick water. They excavated small patches of earth, built fires in them, and burned the wood to make charcoal. That was their occupation, and charcoal was the area's only industry. There was one route in and out of the swamp, a narrow gauge railroad track, often covered with water and unusable. It left people who lived there cut off from the rest of the island for weeks at a time. It was here, in that swamp, that Fidel Castro arrived by helicopter on December 24th, 1959, to celebrate his first Christmas in power. He arrived with soda, beer, and a pig and a half, and invited himself to the home of a resident charcoal worker. I remember, recalled the man later, Fidel said to me, "You're all going to see how buses from Havana are going to come here." I thought he was nuts. Yet by the following Christmas, a newly built highway into the swamp was facilitating the transformation of the whole area. There was a new and fully staffed general hospital, an aqueduct, an electric plant, and a telegraph. A new commercial center had clothing and craft stores, a pharmacy, a butcher, a barber shop, and a post office. 30 literacy workers were in the immediate area teaching people to read and write, and more were expected to arrive soon. And on the beautiful beach called Giron, surrounded by some of the poorest, most unusual countryside on the island, the new government was building a seaside resort. 153 fully furnished 1- and 2-bedroom cabins in a complex that boasted a swimming pool, a cabana, a cafeteria, and more. Construction on the resort was started just a few weeks after Fidel Castro's Christmas visit, and the opening date was set for May 20th, 1961, the 59th anniversary of Cuban independence and the end of the first US military occupation. On a moonlit night, almost 1 month before the scheduled opening of the resort, some 1,400 men sat on vessels off that coast, unaware of all that activity. The men belonged to the US trained and funded Brigade 2506, made up of Cuban exiles returning to topple Fidel Castro. Their plan was to secure a beachhead, spur internal resistance, and spark a general rebellion. 3 days in, a new provisional government for Cuba was to arrive from Miami. Once that happened, the brigade would proceed north north from the beachhead, turn left, and march on Havana. Some expected things to go so well that Fidel's government might fall even before their arrival in the capital. If things went more slowly, or if the men ran into trouble, they would fade into the mountains, link up with insurgents there, and wage the kind of guerrilla war against the Cuban government that Fidel Castro himself had waged against Batista just a few years earlier. Among the first to realize that things would not go as planned were the men of the underwater demolition team, motoring a small launch toward their landing site at Playa Girón. Their job was to set up marker lights that would guide the large vessels and their landing gear onto shore to disembark the brigade members and their material. But as the frogmen approached on their rubber raft, they looked up and saw the beach coming into view ahead. One of the men later recalled it was lit up like Coney Island. 50 yards from where they were supposed to land, people were having a party, and floodlights were lighting up their landing point like daylight. The invaders, it seems, had inadvertently landed in the middle of the construction site that was about to open the resort. Now, to begin this narration in the swamp, with Cuban geography, with Cuban history, with actual residents of the area and their experience in the first 2 years of the revolution, is to remind readers that any discussion of the Bay of Pigs, of the US failure at the Bay of Pigs, has to encompass all that. No landing, no invasion ever occurs on a blank slate, or more literally, an empty beach. History and place cannot be willed away. US power is projected outward, but it comes up against real world people, real world places, whose history necessarily shapes the exercise of US designs. Part 4. So part 4 of my answer about Cuban history as US history forces us to think about the way Cubans are affected by US policies. So if the way I began the Bay of Pigs narration stresses the importance of other places and people and their effects on US policy, I begin my analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis that came about a year afterwards, doing in a way the opposite, focusing on the way ordinary people in other places feel viscerally the effects of US policy and global superpower policy more generally. The Cuban Missile Crisis is usually narrated as a story of 13 days, starting from the moment when Kennedy learned that there were Soviet missiles in Cuba, and ending on day 13 when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. I tell that story too. It's inescapable. It's a central part of the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I choose to frame that story within a different kind of history. This is the last I'll be reading from the book. This is from the chapter on crisis. Okay. In the fall of year 3 of the Cuban Revolution, the world's eyes trained on the sleepy rural town of Santa Cruz de los Pinos, about 65 miles west of Havana. Men there wore traditional peasant hats. Their families cultivated small plots of land, tending pigs, chickens, and the occasional cow. Residents there began to get suspicious when their little town was suddenly overrun with young Soviet soldiers. Earnest, homesick, and with minimal Spanish, they traded watches, soap, shoes, and belts for something called alcoholitis, a 90-proof rum that Cubans considered too strong to drink. The Soviets sought out Cuban girls and Cuban food. They carved their names in the Cyrillic alphabet onto trees and rocks to document their presence in this unremarkable hamlet in far western Cuba. Rumors about their purpose there grew more ominous when the town, where most people still got around on foot, horse, carriage, and the occasional station wagon taxi, suddenly began having traffic jams in the middle of the night. The ground shook with the passing of mammoth trucks, too large to maneuver around corners. A building that housed a shoe shop was partially demolished on the spot to allow for the truck's wide turns. At another corner, the column of a portico disappeared as well. Cuban soldiers motioned for residents to stay inside, but people peered through the wooden slats of their louvered windows. What they saw puzzled them. Trucks with long beds covered with tarps, and under the tarps, objects that they thought looked like the trunks of very large palm trees. Residents of Santa Cruz de los Pinos soon had something else to puzzle over. American airplanes flying low and loud over their town and neighboring countryside. Years later, people remembered those flights as vividly as they remembered the Soviet trucks and the Soviet soldiers. People cowered, assuming the planes would drop bombs. Even though they didn't, the flights confirmed townspeople's sense that something sinister and threatening was afoot. They could feel the danger as a physical sensation, the ground vibrating under the weight of the heavy trucks, the wind kicking up below the low-flying planes, feelings of pins and needles up and down their spines. On October 14th, 1962, a plane flying south to north over Santa Cruz de los Pinos revealed to the world what the villagers cowering for views outside the wooden slats of their windows had not yet learned. That the tree-shaped items on the backs of the trucks were Soviet missiles, known as R-12 missiles by the Soviets and SS-4 by NATO. They had a range of 1,400 miles, enabling them to strike Miami, Washington, and New York. But I just discovered today, not Seattle. A nuclear warhead on each could pack 75 times more power than the US atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. Subsequent flights spotted dozens of missiles scattered over 6 sites across the island, all pointing north in the direction of the United States. The people of Santa Cruz de los Pinos were both the first and the last to know. So by beginning my discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis that way, and by throughout the discussion, trying to bring the reader's attention back to the island, to the ways in which ordinary Cubans lived that terrible moment, right? It was a terrible moment in a history that is too often told as a bilateral one between two powers. And so this is the Cuban Missile Crisis is a major event in the global history of the Cold War, a major event in the history of the US during the Cold War, but it still strikes me how often Cuba, which is the place where the missiles were placed, is left out of that narrative and that discussion. So that was the fourth way I try to think of Cuban history also as American history. And then finally, my last answer to that question, which is very brief, is actually a very personal one. As I point out in the book's preface, I was born in Havana between the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When I was born, my father was in New York, having left the island a few months earlier. My mother and I followed 10 months after my birth. We left the house at 6 p.m. She chose that hour because my brother would be outside playing, and she had not told him that we were leaving and that she was not taking him with us. At the airport, a woman in uniform put her fingers to my earlobes to feel their tiny gold-post earrings, as if about to take them, and then changed her mind. On arriving in Mexico, we left. My mother had to rely on the kindness of a stranger to make it into the city. When we got to Jim Crow, Miami, a few months later, my mother encountered an old acquaintance, helping officials assign newcomers to segregated hotels. When we finally landed in New York, I opened my arms to my waiting father as if I already knew him. These and other stories were my inherited memory of a departure that changed my life. After some initial moving around, Harlem, Brooklyn, Miami, we settled in a place called West New York, New Jersey, a working class community that was predominantly Cuban. On Saturdays, I wrote letters to my brother and my grandmother in Cuba. On Sundays, I listened to our priest pray for the release of political prisoners on the island. Every September 8th, I walked in the procession for Cuba's patron saint, the Virgen del Cobre, Our Lady of Charity, marching past buildings bearing anti-Castro graffiti. I remember my mother crying after work about her son left behind. An absent presence, a present absence. Cuba was impossible to escape. Eventually, I stopped trying, making it instead my life's work. For over 30 years, I have traveled back and forth to the island, visiting family and becoming deeply acquainted with the island's archives and libraries. The history of Cuba that I have spent so long researching and that I was driven to tell in this book is my family's history. It is my history. But I am here and I am American. And that leads me to wonder about the stories and the histories that we all carry. In a country where so many people come from other places, often driven here by the unfolding of historical events, the history of Cuba, the history of Haiti or El Salvador, of Ukraine and Ethiopia, and of other innumerable places is always already present here. So in conclusion, if I were to take all the multiple answers I provided tonight on how this history of Cuba is also an American history, I would distill them all by saying something quite obvious. History always looks different depending on where one stands. Seen from Cuba, America looks different. Indeed, it is not even America, a name that Cubans, like many others across the world, name not the United States, but the two continents of the Western Hemisphere. Cuban history, meanwhile, is many things. One of those is a mirror to the history of the United States. The history of Cuba, then, functions also as a kind of history of the US, as a kind of shadow history, necessarily selective and incomplete. It is a history of the US reimagined from Cuban ground and waters. The book then constitutes, I think in its, ultimately and at its most basic level, constitutes an invitation for US readers to see their own country refracted through the eyes of another, from the outside in, much as I have lived and understood both Cuba and the United States for most of my life.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So Dr. Ferrer has agreed to take some questions. If any folks in the audience have questions, Emily here will come and collect them from you. Just write them on your question card and I will read them because we're trying to capture it for the online audience. Oh, and we can drop, if you didn't get a card, we can also bring those to you. And then I've also invited the online audience, excuse me, to drop questions in the Q&A box. And I will say that Daniel has said, Professor Ferrer, do you know that you are in King County, Washington, and that King County was originally named after William Rufus Devane King, whose name you invoked this evening. It was later renamed after Martin Luther King. Now, I haven't fact checked this, but that's what Daniel says.
Wait, and what place was named after William Rufus King?
King County, which Seattle is part of King County. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a good move to change it to Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Any questions from our in-person audience? Oh, I guess we have one here. Okay, great. Oh, what was your selection process for deciding which stories to tell?
Tonight or in
Um,
general?
I think in general.
It was really hard because no history can ever be complete. There's no such thing, there's no such thing as comprehensiveness in any history. I mean, something like this that tries to tell more than 500 years. Um, Originally, my editor gave me like 100,000 words. It's longer than they wanted, but it's still an amazing feat, I think, to get over 500 years in about 450 pages. So I don't know. I did it kind of instinctively. I kept wanting, I wanted it to feel like it was human. I didn't want it to feel like a textbook. I didn't want to just tell stories about, Fidel Castro or John Kennedy or Christopher Columbus. I wanted to bring in other people. Um, so I tried to do that to the extent possible. And then sometimes, I mean, you can't always get at those stories, so you have to also use them strategically and come back to them. Like that thing that I mentioned about the glowworms, that was something, that was just I was, in Bristol, Rhode Island, looking at letters from that plantation, and someone writing a letter mentioned that in the slave huts, people use glowworms, which are those. I don't know what the scientific term is, but it's like, it's like lightning bugs. So yeah, things that were like those things in the, you know, in lagoons that sometimes light up, at night. There's a scientific word for them that I'm not forgetting. But anyway, that they use them, it served them as candles at night. So it's just a way, and like putting in that detail is just a way of like getting people to remember the ordinary people who are living through this history. So I tried to do that to the extent I could. At the same time, I left out so much. I had a notebook going as I was writing for things I was leaving out. And the notebook just kept getting longer and longer. I couldn't do that. So it was partly like instinct and trying to bring in different kinds of story, making sure that some of the stories were about women. I make race a very central part of the history because a lot of my work before this has been about that.
Thanks for the pause there while I was getting another question from our in-person audience. You had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Cuba had supported America in the American Revolution, and the patron is wondering if that meant that the revolution was being supported by the Catholic government in Spain.
Yes, so it was being supported by the Spanish, and it was hard for them to decide that because they were worried that supporting an independence movement would give ideas to their own very many Spanish colonies. So, but American agents met with the Spanish, and they agreed to provide, they sent blankets, they sent uniforms, but the main thing that they provided was they gave the 13 rebellious colonies most favored nation status in the port of Havana. And Havana received a regular silver subsidy from Mexico. And so a lot of that silver currency made its way through, to the US. The other thing is that, in that trade, it was vital to the revolutionaries. And some, like the 13 colonies would send flour, and they would get sugar, they would get lumber, they would just get silver currency, and they used all that. And then I mentioned the Battle of Yorktown, and there's the thing, you grow up, I don't know, some of us grow up hearing about the French, Lafayette and the French contribution to the American Revolution. The money that arrived, Washington hadn't paid his troops in forever. The money that arrived right before that battle that allowed Washington to announce that he was going to pay the army came from Cuba. A French and a Spanish agent went to Havana and collected money. They say that there's a story that Cuban women gave their jewels for the cause, and that was a vital contribution at a very critical moment. So that's another example.
We have lots of questions from our online audience as well. So Gina asks, can you talk about the Pedro Pan in the 1960s? My father was sent here alone to live and ended up being brought up by the priests, brought in by the priests in Miami. Later, he helped bring my grandparents and aunts and uncles to the US.
So, yeah, I have a long chapter in the book that talks about migration and exile and the arrival of Cubans in the US. I think that really there's no way for anyone to understand contemporary Cuba if they don't also really try to grapple with Miami. Miami's full of former revolutionaries in one way or another. You can't tell the history of Havana without understanding Miami, just like you can't tell the history of Cuba. The Pedro Pan migration that the listener points to was early in the revolution. There were almost from the beginning, especially after the first agrarian reform of 1959, there began to surface accusations about whether the government was communist or not. And one of the rumors that circulated was that the government was going to take children away from parents and send them to the Soviet Union to brainwash them. So there was basically an exodus of unaccompanied minors organized by the Catholic Church that took several thousand young Cubans to the United States and placed them with families, sometimes in Miami, but just as often in places like Indiana or Omaha, places like that. And then the families, their parents usually came after, sometimes several months, sometimes several years. But it is, I think it may, I'm not quite sure about this, but I think it may be the first organized unaccompanied migration to the United States.
Wow. Another question from Kambul in the online audience. Why does the US persist with the Cuban embargo? Who does it benefit and what does it accomplish? If it's designed to bring down the Castro regime and its legacy, it's obviously not working. Wouldn't all parties benefit from free and open relations?
Yeah, the embargo was put in place early in the revolution. The idea was that it would put pressure, by putting economic pressure on Cuba. Cuban people would feel that pressure and rise up against the government. It would destabilize the government and ultimately result in the end of the Castro government. That obviously never happened. So it's just a little aside. My father died a couple months ago at the age of 100, and I spent the last couple of weeks reading some of his letters. And he used to, he didn't go to high school, he didn't go to college, but he took to writing late in life. And he used to write to public officials. So he would write to Fidel Castro, he would write to George Bush and Bill Clinton, And so he wrote to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton replied. And he said, we haven't played, and Bill Clinton said this, I think it was in 1994, said, we have in place an embargo that is designed to get the Cuban government to basically to stop its human rights abuses. That was not the intention originally, but even under that intention, that's not either, because almost every time the US has tightened the embargo, Cuba has responded with more attacks on human rights. So even on that level, there's no way that the policy has worked. In the ultimate goal of producing a change in government, it has worked in making life more difficult for the Cuban government and getting access to goods and so on. But I think it's a foolhardy policy. It's never worked. I think that the policy that Obama pursued, which, Obama didn't end the embargo, and no president can end the embargo without approval of Congress, and he didn't do that. But I think that his policy of opening, was path-breaking. It was the first time, because the way everyone saw it before is that there would be incremental change. Cuba would do this, and then the US would do this. Cuba would do this, and then the US. And he basically just said, we're going to start on a path to normalizing relations. He didn't ask for anything in return up front, right? But my sense from, I was there when he visited, is that there was, and at the time, the Cuban government was engaged in some very modest economic reforms that was creating more space for small private businesses. I think if that policy had continued, there would have been more of an opening. Little by little, it wouldn't have been like a change in government, but there would have been an opening that would have made people's lives in Cuba, right? That didn't happen, and when Donald Trump became president and reversed all those Obama openings, a lot of Republicans who favored, Trump's policy on Cuba said, well, the Obama policy never worked, which is the most absurd thing you can say, because that policy was in place basically for 2 years. And what they were advocating was returning to a policy that had been in place for 60 years and not worked. So, so I think I agree with the question.
Thank you. Let's see, we have several questions asking about your brother, and if
My
it's not
what?
your brother, and if it's not too personal, folks are wondering if you've been able to reconnect, or was your brother, somebody says, thank you for sharing your knowledge and personal experience, very enlightening. Was your brother eventually able to immigrate to the US? And so there's a lot of questions.
So he did come to the US during the Mariel boat lift of 1980, which I discuss in the book. It's a major seaborne migration, a seaborne exodus that brought about 125,000 Cubans to Florida shores in the space of about 5 months. And as an aside, in the last year, Cubans are mostly arriving on the US-Mexico border on a scale that is about twice what Mariel was. So I think we're at close to I think we're at over 200,000 Cubans arriving. Mostly on the US-Mexico border. But anyway, back to my brother. I don't want to talk that much about it here, just to say that he did come during 1980. I wrote an article about my mother and my brother and me that was published in the New Yorker in March 1, 2021. So if anyone's interested.
We'll Google it.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more wonderful questions. This one asks, and kind of ties into what you're talking about there, what do you see as the later generations, Cubans who are Cuban American born in the US, what do you see as their views and perceptions of Cuba, US, and their station in society?
I think the views of second and third generation Cuban Americans are pretty diverse. So I think they run the gamut from favoring opening to being very skeptical of an opening. They're, I don't know what the split is between Republican and Democrat, but I would imagine it's pretty even. The issue that I think most people don't people tend to think of Cuban migration as something that happened in the 60s, and then in certain key moments like the 1980 boat lift and the 1994 rafter crisis. But if you look at the population of South Florida, the biggest group of Cuban Americans in South Florida are people who arrived after 1995. So they're not second or third gen. Now some of them maybe. 1995 was longer ago than I remember. But then I think about, we're all getting old. But anyway, so Cuban American, it's less about the second and third generation than about new arrivals. And the new arrivals are skewing much, much more Republican than second and third generation.
That's interesting. Well, switching tactics slightly here, or topics slightly, I think we've got a question from an anonymous attendee online. In your research, have you spent time studying or visiting the Haitian exiles in Montreal? They are the city's largest immigrant group.
I've been to Montreal, and I presented before I did this book, I presented my work on Cuba and Haiti in Montreal, and in Miami, and in Cuba, and in Santiago, which is in eastern Cuba, and the place in Cuba that received the most Haitian immigrants. In the same way that I think you can't really that all these histories are just so interconnected. The way that we thought about national history, Cuban history, and U.S. history just doesn't work. You can't understand Cuban history unless you understand the Haitian Revolution. Certainly can't understand, Cuban history. Anyway, and I'm heading to Montreal. Oh, great.
I wanted to share a comment from Pam. Pam says, I love how you humanize the story. I feel, all in caps, I feel connected to this history and just reserved the book via the library, and I'm eager to dig in. I think your story about traversing the US with mom sounds so familiar to here and now. It could be in many of our family histories too. So share that comment there. And then we also have a question from Anna online saying, based on a short visit in early 2002, I saw that Cuban society seemed much more racially integrated than US society.
Racially what?
Racially integrated than US society, but does that integration carry into the highest leadership in the governing structures?
No, not really. No, that's the short answer. No, it doesn't. It doesn't carry over into the higher levels of leadership. So, yeah, I mean, race it's lived differently in Cuba than the U.S. So there is less formal segregation. But there's but that doesn't mean that there isn't racism and that there isn't racial discrimination, because there definitely is. And in some ways, in the first decades of the revolution did a lot to reverse the most pernicious effects of racism from the colonial and early national period. But what's happened in the last 30 or so years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the fall of the Soviet Union created this massive economic crisis in Cuba. And the Cuban government tried to solve that by returning to things like tourism. And that whole process just reintroduced all kinds of racial divisions, and people started opening businesses, but who had access to money from outside to open the businesses. So there's a lot of deep division today, even though you don't see the discrimination the same way. I mean, the segregation in the same way.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we have one final question from our in-person audience, and I saved a big question for last. How do you imagine the further relationship between Cuba and the US?
Doesn't look good.
I guess it was a short answer.
Yeah, I mean, it just I think, if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, I think she would have continued the Obama policy. After Trump was elected, Biden couldn't really go back to that. He considered it too dangerous. So if you look at the platform of the Democratic Party in 2020, it didn't list, for example, ending the U.S. embargo on Cuba as a goal in Biden's platform. And I just feel like, Biden's had so much to deal with since he took office, right? The pandemic, January 6th, all this stuff. But if you think about the election tomorrow, right? It doesn't give me much faith that things will move in the right direction, which is unfortunate. It's one of the many unfortunate things, not the end ones.
Okay, those are some sobering words to end on. We're so appreciative that you spent this evening helping educate us about Cuba and our relationship with the US. Let's give Dr. Ferrer one more round of applause.
Thank you.